Start the recording. Whoa, we definitely turned it up in here. All right, I'm gonna do the intro and then turn it over to you.
Yes,
We still have people signing in, so hopefully it's not too noisy. All right, good morning, everybody. We're gonna get started here in just a minute. Quick reminder, we have the first week of June, was it the 3rd or the 4th? I have Keith Escalante come in and he's gonna be at Shown Farm to do a grape trunk disease workshop with us. So if you have any grapevines that look suspect, he also said, bring one with you. We'll dissect it together in the class. I did ask for people to register for that, just so we kind of have a estimate of how many people are showing up. It's free for VidTech group members, so as long as you've renewed, shouldn't have any problem with that. And then June meeting, we don't have that set yet, but I have heard, and I don't know if anybody else has heard this, but I have heard of some downy mildew in the area, and I don't know if anyone else has heard about that. So, okay, good. I'm thinking about reaching out to Timothy Miles and having him Zoom in from University of Michigan, unless he's planning to be out here this way. But so I'm working on that. It's not set yet, but watch for the announcement on that one. And then we're trying something new today. We haven't done this before, but this is so that we can get CEUs without having to do a bunch of pop-up quizzes in the middle of this Zoom presentation. So we're having Michelle Zoom in live, which qualifies as a live meeting. And the sign-in sheet's not here yet. I just found out that Rachel's out in the field with DPR this morning. So Misty's printing off the sign-in sheets. So for your CEUs, be sure to sign in on the way out. Sign in on the way out. So we'll have them set up over here on the way out, but be sure to not miss that opportunity. And then I'm just going to turn over to Michelle. So for Q&A towards the end, or if we have some questions, I do have a microphone that'll help Michelle here. So we'll try it, but maybe take a second. If you raise your hand, I'll bring a microphone around and we'll get it done that way. But Michelle, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you.
I think we're set.
Awesome. Well, thanks guys for entertaining a Zoom presentation. I was talking to Sandy and Jason prior to this, and just like you guys, May is a very busy month for us in the grape world. We're already at bloom, so I'm busy doing a lot of product trials right now. So I just couldn't take the time to hop on a plane on down. So I do apologize for that. Also, second point of order, I'm just getting over some pretty horrific spring allergies. So I have a little bit of some lung spasm. So I'm sucking on a cough drop. So I apologize that affects audio a little bit. It's better than that and me coughing into the microphone for the next hour. So I do apologize for that, but hopefully we can get through this smoothly. And again, apologize for the not being there and then also having this horrific cough during this talk. So the topic for today is kind of two topics that Sandy asked me to mesh together as best I could. So I tried to do that, both focusing on what to do with disease management in the situation of idling your own vineyards or having to deal with a neighbor who may have an abandoned or idled vineyard next to you. And then also how that might interact with fungicide resistance and fungicide resistance management. And then the bigger overall hot topic for 2026 in general, just general powdery mildew management and weather conditions, et cetera. So I tried to creatively mesh that together for today, and hopefully it'll make sense by the end. But the big thing, so we're going to hit those three topics: idling vineyards, fungicide resistance, and general kind of environmental pressures, both within the canopy, so microclimate, and then mesoclimate, so within a region, and how that impacts disease development. And hopefully kind of clarify some terms here too when we go through the difference between idling vineyards and abandoning vineyards and how that might impact disease management for both yourself and disease and bringing a vineyard back out of that situation for in the case of idle. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about idling vineyards and what it means or what we're all trying to make it mean or define, because I think this is something that, is probably relatively new to the United States en masse. Other regions across the world have gone through this. Australia probably more recently in terms of like relative counterparts. But it is going to be region and location specific on how we define some of these things, and honestly how we come out of that on the other side. So I I want to first define what idling versus abandoned means, because I think we sometimes don't distinguish those two, but they do have two separate meanings. And they also, the meaning is important because it tells you how quickly you can rejuvenate a particular vineyard and bring it back into production. So at least here in Washington or in the PNW, we're defining idling as reducing, so not stopping, but reducing management in a particular block with the intent of returning to production in 1 to 2 years. So it's truly that. It's like idling an engine. Engine's still on, but we're not going forward, right? Mothballing is kind of an intermediate area, or which is reducing vineyard management with the intent of returning in 3 to 5 years. Obviously, the Australians are the ones that have coined the term mothballing. And mothballing really is traditionally, when we think of where that has happened globally, when the Australians were doing that, they were mothballing vineyards partly for economic reasons, like the United States. The other part is they were in the middle of a 10-year drought, so they just didn't have the resources to actually keep a vineyard going. So in that situation, it was semi-abandoned because they couldn't put in inputs, but there was always the intent of, if water flows again, we're going to bring these things out. And abandoned is just totally not managed, with no intent really to pull out, or no immediate intent or idea of where that vineyard will go in the next couple of years. So those are kind of the different levels. So idling, you're doing stuff, but the intent is to bring it back into production shortly. Mothballing, you're hopefully going to bring production back, but maybe 3 to 5 years. And then abandon is you really don't have any immediate plans for what that vineyard's going to do. And so the reason why that matters, obviously, is as you guys drive around or perhaps farming yourself, is the things that you do in that vineyard block really obviously will change when it's idling or mothballed or abandoned, change a lot of dynamics for management. So first, a lot of it relates to what that canopy looks like in the vineyard. And obviously, when we're dealing with disease management, canopy means a lot of things because it helps create microclimates and environments where pests and diseases can thrive. And so some of these recommendations or things we're going to talk, or I will mention in the next couple of slides, they're not do this is the best action, or do that, this other action is the best. It's a lot of it is personal management choice and what kind of resources you have to use on an idled or mothballed or potentially abandoned block. So they are very personal choices. But many of you guys probably have seen some people in a mothballed or idled or even abandoned situation are either choosing to not prune, which creates very large canopy very early. They're lightly pruning, essentially kind of hedging or skirting, or what we're doing a lot here in Washington is we're severely pruning. So mechanical pruning down to 1 bud spurs with the hope of really reducing fruiting shoots on that particular vineyard. And those all create very different canopy types at different times of the season. In-season canopy management is probably the first thing that goes when you have financial restrictions on a vineyard. So obviously people are not shoot thinning, perhaps definitely most likely not leaf removing, and probably very little canopy training. So now you have, in some cases, lots of shoots that are not being managed. So just again, very, very dense, very large canopies in many situations. Irrigation, obviously, in areas that folks have access to irrigation, or that is their primary water source, irrigation can be a huge tool for mitigating some of those negative consequences with canopy management. So if you can turn off water at certain times, you can reduce the growth of that canopy. Or in many cases, if you can turn it off during bloom, et cetera, you can reduce the amount of crop that the vineyard is carrying. So the ability to truly tightly control irrigation, or having access or lack of access to irrigation, can really affect canopy development. And then the final point, or probably similar to canopy management, usually what we see in idled blocks is the first thing that goes is people stop fertilizing, because why waste money on replenishing nutrients in a vineyard if you don't plan to sell that fruit? And obviously reduction in fertilization can, especially nitrogen, can help reduce canopy growth and help, again, mitigate some of that excessive development that might happen if you are choosing to not prune at all or to not do any canopy management. The next step, so, in an idled or an abandoned vineyard situation, we have these different canopy shapes, but then there also comes down to true disease management. And one thing I think a lot of us struggle with is that transition or mindset difference between how we manage disease when our intent is to sell fruit, and how do we the degree to which we manage disease when our intent is to just keep that vine alive for another year or two. And if you're going into this idled vineyard situation, or if you have a neighbor that's idling, you're probably noticing they're likely not spraying a whole lot. There's varying degrees on that, which we will talk about at the end of this presentation. But if you are truly idling, there is a very different mindset going in there. If you're not doing the canopy management, if the vineyard is relatively dense, any products you will put on will have a difficult time controlling disease. And of course, the crop will probably look absolutely horrible, but you're not selling that crop that year. And so that you have to make a decision pretty early on if you are designing spray programs with the potential maybe you might sell that fruit at the end of the season. And if that's a very different type of disease management regime, then if committing to that fruit's not being sold this year, my goal is just to keep the canopy semi-healthy. I don't care what the fruit looks like. And so these are obviously two very, very different goals. I get a lot of questions up here in Washington where a lot of our idled blocks are on a sulfur regime a couple times a year, maybe 3, 4. And they get a little mildew in there. They're quite upset by that. And we always go back to, well, if 3 to 4 sprays of sulfur a year gave you perfectly clean canopies, then we wouldn't be spraying anything else, right? So there is, if you are reducing disease, you should disease management inputs, you should expect a little bit more disease. But whether or not that's tolerable for you for keeping the vine healthy versus intending to sell the fruit. I don't know how many of you guys have access to extension resources outside of California. I know there's quite a number getting related to vineyard idling, going through various industry magazines and also through the UC Cooperative Extension. Those are all good guides and resources to just farm specific options. But if you want to see what we're doing here in the Pacific Northwest, myself, Patty Skinkis at Oregon State University, and Marcus Keller here at Washington State did write a guide on managing idled vineyard blocks. It is P&W specific, but there's obviously a lot of overlap environmentally between Willamette Valley and all the way to dry eastern Washington. So we do cover the gamut of environments there. So if you're interested in that, this is a QR code that will take you to that website. That's how WC publishes things now, but it is printable. And we go through different aspects of pruning, canopy management, fertilizing, insect, disease, virus management, etc., crop load management on when you're idling a block. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check that out. But also you have a lot of great resources through the University of California Cooperative Extension. So I know that was like a weird little thing on idling, but that we're going to get back to why that matters when we start talking about fungicide resistance at the end of the presentation. But I just wanted to put that out on when we talk about idling, there's still some minimal management. Abandoning means there's no management. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page there. The other thing Sandy, I think, wanted for me to chat about was environmental factors, both within that canopy, so how idling practices might affect the microclimate in the vine, and then also just bigger regional weather patterns, because I'm sure none of us can turn on the radio, listen or watch news, or read, Apple News on your phone without hearing about the super El Nino that is going to happen. Clearly, we're very in tuned to different weather patterns and weather cycles, and probably you guys are experiencing it as well this year. We've had here in the PNW a very warm early start to the spring, and then suddenly it became winter again, and we're going through these oscillations of extreme heat followed by extreme cold. And we're 2 to 3 weeks ahead of schedule in vine development, but also our growing degree days are accumulating relatively slowly. So it's a weird situation where plants are behaving as if it's a warm year, but disease pressure is quite high because of these weird cooling cycles that we're seeing. And I think that's going to drive a lot of disease as we progress through this growing season. So when we think about disease management, we talk about weather constantly with powdery mildew, because powdery mildew is just super sensitive to the environmental conditions that are around it, especially immediately around it within the canopy. And so powdery mildew is a Goldilocks disease. It hates super high temperatures when you start getting above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which especially water-stressed canopies or in the middle of summer canopies that are well exposed with a lot of sunlight, it's very easy for leaf surface temperature to get above 95 Fahrenheit. It also hates when temperatures are below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you get this kind of sweet spot of around 75 degrees on average, powdery does quite well. It also, because it grows mostly on the surface of tissue, it is very sensitive to UV light, both naturally occurring UVA and UVB, and of course, artificially applied UVC. So when it's exposed to sunlight and high temperatures, mildew is heavily suppressed. But if it is cloudy, or we have excessive smoke coverage and UV rays are blocked, that actually is quite, or canopies are large and providing a shady environment, that increases the risk or the favorability for powdery mildew to develop. Powdery also likes humid conditions. And I think we often get confused with humidity and rain. They're two very different things. Powdery actually doesn't do well in the growing season with really wet environments. Water on the leaf surface actually can suppress powdery mildew. But general water in the environment, whether it's through transpiration or heavily grown cover crops, big, large canopies where the exterior might be wet from rainfall, but the interior is just excessively humid, that those humid conditions are what powdery mildew is looking for. So anywhere above 40% relative humidity up to 100, powdery does pretty darn good. And when it gets excessively dry, though, and especially for water stressing canopies or canopies are able to dry out, powdery mildew doesn't do so well. So again, it likes things just right. It likes nice humid conditions, just not too wet, not too dry. It likes, partially cloudy or not heavily UV light conditions, and it likes moderate temperatures. So when we combine all these things and create these kind of ideal environment, which also sounds kind of nice from time to time for humans as well, that's when powdery thrives. And of course, we cannot control the weather, but we can control grapevine canopies. And that's why we always talk about the importance of canopy management when we're talking about disease control relative to powdery mildew. So when we can control the canopy, whether through irrigation or appropriate fertilization, hedging, canopy training, shoot thinning, leaf removal, all these things that reduce the volume of the canopy, open it up, allow it to dry out faster, and allow sunlight to penetrate, we're reducing the favorability for powdery mildew. So you can imagine all those labor and input intensive things that we do during a normal management cycle to help reduce mildew. As soon as we remove those, because we're trying to save money in an idled or mothballed or even abandoned situation, we're just creating this perfectly dense environment for powdery mildew to thrive. One thing that can help us, though, in terms of Mother Nature is, and perhaps even a super El Nino, although I think the temperatures are going to hit later than what we would like, is when you have extremely dry conditions and extremely hot conditions during the critical window for powdery mildew on fruit, which is from rachis elongation to about 4 weeks after 100% bloom, you can get a lot of control on your crop alone. And so I've shown this picture a couple of times. So folks who have seen mildew talks given by me in the past, this is probably old hat, so I apologize. But I think this is a really good example. This picture here is a really good example of how much environment can control powdery mildew in vineyards. And so what you're seeing here is my research block here at WSU Prosser. And so like Akeef Escon, so I know he's visiting you guys in July or in June. Akeef and I both do spray trials effectively, right, where we're evaluating products. And as a part of spray trials, we always have those glorious untreated checks where we do nothing. And we do nothing in these blocks for, 10, 15 small microsections, but for 10 or 15 years on end. So we can grow. Akeef and I are pretty good at growing a lot of mildew in very, very tight locations. So we have these untreated checks. And in 2021 here in Washington, probably similar to you guys, and we all heard of the situation up in British Columbia, is during June, we had a heat dome. And so we hit, I think here, it was like 90 degrees the week before bloom. During bloom, we hit about 110, and then it stayed above 100 degrees for about 15 days. I think the peak temperature we saw was 117. Relative humidity was down like 5% during the peak heat of the day. And it was absolutely ridiculous. But we were in these excessively hot temperatures, almost the entire critical window. And my untreated vines, so absolutely no fungicides for about 10 years, which usually are just totally decimated by the end of the growing season. I'm going to see my little laser pointer here. If you look here, this is pretty clean fruit, pretty darn clean. A little mildew on the canopy here and there. You can actually see stuff that developed a little bit later season, but we had nearly clean fruit. It was a bad year for fungicide trials because my untreated checks were disease-free. So everything, well, or maybe I should say it was a good year for fungicide trials because it looked like everything worked, because we just literally had no disease in this vineyard. The very next year, though, as it typically happens, is we had a very cool period during bloom. So highs in the 70s to low 80s, a little bit of cloud cover. I mean, it was fantastic for fruit set, but also very good for mildew. So these exact same vines, the very next year, went from being completely disease-free to totally loaded with powdery mildew. So I just highlighting that Mother Nature, that we really should not discount the value of both mesoclimate and microclimates within the canopy and how much that can influence our disease control programs, and why cultural practices and open canopies and good canopy training and good airflow are all really, really important to give us that extra edge, and to complement any type of chemical regime we might be doing in the vineyard. So this is my little like a very visual image of how much environment matters, especially when we're dealing with disease control on fruit. The other thing, when we start thinking about environment, not only on how it impacts the pathogen, but a lot of environmental conditions can significantly influence the efficacy or the efficiency of how we spray. And I think over the years, one thing I've noticed both in the blocks that I manage here at the Washington State University and with doing site visits is we're all good viticulturists, so we try our hardest with the resources for canopy management and vine growth. We have fantastic folks writing spray recommendations. You know, they rotate fungicides, everything looks good, timing looks great, but things still fail, and things are often failing because we forget the one very critical component, which is the actual act of applying a pesticide. So your sprayer and the environmental conditions at the time of the application. Usually spray programs are failing, at least what I see up here, is because of the sprayer or when a product or the environmental conditions at the time that the spray was applied. And so when we go into weather extremes or when the environment is rapidly shifting, that can truly affect a program that has always worked, might stop working, and it's probably not fungicide resistance. It's just the environmental conditions in which you're doing the spray. So first thing that obviously impacts sprays, as we know, is wind speed, right? And I think over the years, we've kind of stretched the extremes in which we're going to run a sprayer, and part of that has to do with just cost of tractors and operating costs. So, you know, if we're trying to spray more acres with fewer pieces of equipment, we're often testing the limits in which we can get through a particular block or a particular ranch, or, you know, complete that first spray pass might take, you know, 13 to 14 days, and obviously weather conditions change a lot. But when you are idling a block or are delaying things or essentially stretching intervals because you're trying to get more bang for your buck because you're trying not to put as much inputs in, the longer you stretch intervals, the more important it is that the time you actually do get out to spray, that the weather conditions are just right. And I think a lot of us can agree that finding just right weather conditions or consistent weather patterns is getting more difficult from year to year because of weather extremes and shifts. And so finding wind speed is just one of those things. Another thing is the right relative humidity when you spray and the time of day that you can actually get out and spray. The hotter and drier it is, the faster water droplets will evaporate. If water droplets evaporate, that means less product potentially hitting your vineyard canopy and also more products potentially drifting, right? So wind speed, relative humidity, temperature, all these things will, at the time of the actual spray application, all influence product efficacy and your ability to control things. And of course, if we're trying to stretch intervals or trying to do more with less, we pigeonhole ourselves into spraying in less than ideal conditions. The other challenge too, and we see it here in Washington, that timing is really ideally some of the best times to spray tends to be in the early morning, right? When before midday, at least here in Washington, winds always will pick up at around 10 a.m. before peak heat of the day, between about 2 and 3 p.m. But again, we can't always target those if we are trying to do more with less or cover more acres with fewer bits of equipment. But again, there are some tricks and tips that you can do to help reduce drift, try to get droplets to the target And that's really what I'm trying to show here is if you have to spray in slightly warmer conditions or in conditions of lower humidity, rethink what type of spray you're actually using. So electrostatic sprayers are not great for very dry environments because those droplets are already very, very small, and the electrostatic charge is not necessarily strong enough to overcome the rate of evaporation. So if you're in a hot, dry environment, perhaps an electrostatic sprayer isn't for you. If you're in a humid environment, totally fine. If you're in a hot, dry environment and you do have exchangeable nozzles on your particular sprayer, maybe consider using air induction nozzles. And you may say, hey, Michelle, but I only use air induction nozzles are for weed sprayers. And that's true, but air induction nozzles create very large but hollow droplets. Those droplets essentially have a little more drag when they're flying through the air towards your canopy, so they're less likely to be moved with slightly higher wind speeds. Obviously, there's a limit to that, but they also evaporate slower, so they can hit the canopy and actually hit the target. So something to think about if you're noticing in your management processes, you're idling certain blocks, or you're starting to lose a labor force and cannot find tractor drivers, and you're again doing more with less, is maybe think about adjusting equipment accordingly to help you get through the time period. Obviously, we don't want necessarily, I'm not encouraging folks to spray at wrong times, but if you absolutely have to, there are some tweaks you can do to your machine to help you get the spray to where it needs to go. And of course, by doing that, improve the efficiency of and the efficacy of the programs that you're already developing. So again, goal is trying to do more with less. So general summary, whether it's spray practices or environmental conditions that are good for powdery mildew, as we start moving into the 2026 growing season, the thing to just remember is powdery mildew likes things to be just right. It is a Goldilocks disease. It likes moderate temperatures. It likes moderate to high relative humidity. It likes indirect or well, it doesn't like sunlight, but it does best with indirect or diffuse sunlight. So we're thinking cloud coverage, canopy coverage, shade, or honestly smoke will increase the potential environmental favorability for powdery mildew. And then those indirect influences. So when you are not, if you're not heavily pruning your vineyard and you essentially have a lot of little shoots, those are a lot of little active, very sensitive and susceptible growing points pushing across the entire canopy. So a lot of little points of potential infection for powdery mildew. And if you allow disease to build up year after year, and especially if you are choosing to not prune your vineyard, you increase the potential risk of having buds that become infected with mildew and then flag shoots the following season. So dense, lots of lack of pruning begets flag shoots, which can beget larger hot spots of mildew in the vineyard over time, especially if you're if you're no longer idling and you're mothballing a vineyard for a longer period of time. All right, so now let's talk about fungicide resistance. So kind of transitioning between things that can influence what idling vineyards can do to a canopy and potential microclimates within the vine, to what influences powdery mildew, to what impacts our ability to actually control powdery mildew. And the big one, obviously, is fungicide resistance. So as you guys know, fungicides all work in different ways. We have contact fungicides that kind of must hit the target in order for them to function. So those tend to be things like sulfur, oil, etc. We have some products that can be absorbed by the plant as soon as they land and maybe move through the leaf tissue, but they don't move very far. So those are called translaminar. We like those products in the sense that they kind of overcome some coverage issues. So it helps the product kind of redistribute in the plant internally. So if you have poor spray coverage, translaminar and systemic products overcome that a little bit. So we unfortunately kind of have a little bit of a handicap with that we get away with a lot worse spray practices when we have these products available. If we stop using these products and you switch back to contact, then you start to notice that perhaps you have some problems with what your spray coverage is. That shows up pretty quick. And the beauty, again, with translaminar is once they're absorbed, the products stay active and they're a little less prone to degradation due to the environment. And then we have some products that are systemic, but I will say for most fungicides, there are very, very few products that are truly fully systemic that can really move long distance in the plant. Most systemic fungicides are moving through the leaf, maybe up to the next leaf or so. They're not truly fully moving in the plant. There are a few exceptions, but very few. when fungicides do tend to be systemic, they tend to be xylem mobile. So they'll move from the point of contact up. They don't move in both directions. Again, some exceptions to that, but pretty rare. What makes products at risk for fungicide resistance development really was what they're doing in the pathogen, or what they're targeting in order to kill that potential target organism. And the point of this slide is to show that different fungicides work on different things within the target fungus. Some of it works on destroying DNA synthesis. Some of it degrades membranes. And so all these different types of modes of action, if you will, have different complexities within the fungus, and the chemistries that attack them also have different complexities. And what that ultimately means is some fungicides have the ability, or some fungi have the ability to develop resistance to certain products quickly if that particular fungicide is targeting something very specific. Other fungicides target kind of more general things within the organism, or mechanisms that are much harder for the organism to develop resistance to. So then you see them last a little bit longer in the vineyard. So this is why when we say fungicide resistance happens, it's not like it suddenly hits every single fungicide the same way. It's going to hit them differently based on what they're targeting within that fungal organism. If you want to go in depth on this, Tim Miles and I recently published a review article that's free to access in the American Journal of Phenology and Viticulture that goes through a huge review on fungicide resistance development in powdery mildew, downy mildew, and botrytis bunch rot, and I believe, so powdery, downy, and botrytis. So you can read up on that, and I'll have a QR code in the next couple of slides where you can see that article. But fundamentally, what drives resistance is the pathogen's life cycle and genetics. So things that tend to reproduce really quickly also can develop resistance relatively quickly. How we as a farming community choose to apply products can affect fungicide resistance. So that broken sprayer, or switch, using a systemic product and going back to a contact and not realizing, oh, my coverage actually wasn't great. So poor spray efficacy, that will in fact impact potential fungicide resistance selection. So it's not the switching, but just the noticing that, hey, my nozzles are clogged, my sprayer is not putting product out like I thought they were. The actual fungicide itself, of course, what it's targeting within the organism, how the chemistry is developed or protected within the solution of the chemistry that's being applied can affect it. And then, of course, the fungicide, the site vulnerability within the target organism. So is that particular thing that the fungicide is targeting in the fungus to kill it something that's super conserved, and there's only one of it within the fungus, and the fungus will probably so that way when resistance develops, it's quite quick and rapid? Or is it essentially targeting something that the fungus might have a redundancy for, and able to kind of keep metabolizing that particular fungicide? So the easy way to kind of define that is if the fungus reproduces quickly, you have a high risk of resistance development. If you spray frequently, more frequent treatments means higher risk of resistance development. The more specific the product is to the fungus, which we often really like because it means it's not hitting off-target organisms, well, that also means higher risk of resistance development. And how easy it is to spray can influence that. So when something's very easy to spray, means you get really good coverage. It's actually pretty low risk. That reduces the risk of resistance development. If it is very difficult to spray and get good coverage and get the product to where it needs to go, then you have a high risk it increases the risk of resistance development. So that's all kind of just general resistance. You've probably heard it ad nauseum before, read it on all the fungicide labels. And so you're probably just really wanting to know, okay, which fungicides do I have to worry about? Well, you are probably all very aware that FRAC 11 is the kind of poster child of fungicide resistance, at least in grape powdery mildew, also probably botrytis and in some small cases, downy mildew on the East Coast. But FRAC 11 resistance, so those are your QOI or strobilurine fungicides, it's pretty widespread across the United States. The graphic you're seeing here is actually from the FRAME project, which looked at fungicide resistance. And if you see yellow or blue, that means these are samples of powdery mildew fungi that were collected in both California, Ohio, just different states, if you will. The more yellow and blue means contains the resistance mutation and either is fully resistant or is a mixed population of resistant and sensitive individuals. And so if you kind of look across the spectrum, let's look at the top three grape states, California, Oregon, and Washington. We got a lot of resistance happening out there to FRAC 11 fungicides. And of course, FRAC 11 fungicides are commonly used across a diversity of specialty crops. California, Oregon, and Washington grow a diversity of specialty crops. Many of us are farming a diversity of crops. So these are products that we like to use because we can apply them across that said diversity. But of course, in this particular case, FRAC 11 fungicide resistance, it's a single gene mutation that the fungus can develop. It doesn't really have a whole lot of fitness costs. There's a little bit there, so it stays within the population. So, and we use a lot of FRAC 11 fungicides. So this is a qualitative resistance. So once the fungicide stops working, it stops working epically. So it's like you're spraying nothing if you spray FRAC 11 fungicides on a resistant population. So we have this is here. This is not going away. And so it's something that we have to be careful of. You guys have already adjusted programs. And in fact, I know you have, because we've done some surveys across the PNW and know that in general, people have kind of reduced their use of FRAC 11 fungicides, which is great because resistance issues. So why spray it if it's going to be a problem? You can start to reintroduce FRAC 11 fungicides after you've stepped away from them for a couple of years. We've seen that done well, but you do have to do so with caution, either tank mixing or applying them at not critical windows of development. So in California and here in the PNW too, we've reduced FRAC 11. We've also reduced our use of FRAC 3s and FRAC 7 fungicides, and we'll talk a little bit about those in the next slides because of resistance issues. Same here in Washington, we're potentially seeing FRAC 13, so that's quinoxaphene, Quintec slippage there as well. So we've stopped using them, or we're reducing our use of them, so that's good. But we've swapped that by saying, well, hey, if I can't use a FRAC 11, or if I'm going to use FRAC 11, or if I'm going to do resistance mitigation strategies, I'm going to tank mix everything with sulfur. So we see that we've seen an uptick in sulfur use in the last couple of years, and that has some benefits. But what I'm very concerned about is, especially in California and maybe a little bit in Washington, is well, I guess in Washington as well, is we've seen more people use FRAC 50, so Vivando Perlevo, and U6, so Torino products. We're like, ooh, these are brand new FAC groups and we can cycle them in and out and they have pretty decent intervals. Well, there is resistance reported to these products in Europe. So Europe is a great test bed. They always overuse fungicides, even though they don't, but they do. When the new product comes on the market, they like to use it a lot in a single year. So we'll just put it that way. So they see resistance develop first, and we do have reports of FRAC 50 and U6 resistance in Europe. So it says that this is possible and probable. And when we start switching from overusing one product to overusing another, essentially all we're doing is just moving that selection pressure to these other fungicides. I'm a little nervous that we've overly backed off FRAC 11s and have decided that FRAC 50s and U6s are going to be our fun new product that we're going to play with, and we're probably going to burn through those pretty quickly too if we are overusing them. So that's just a note of caution. So if you're using FRAC 50s or U6s, hopefully you're not using them more than once a growing season in your regime, because I think we will quickly lose those if we start using them more frequently. The challenge, though, with fungicide resistance is, in many cases, pathogens can start to carry multiple fungicide resistance. So you have a particular powdery mildew population that might be FRAC 11 resistant, but it could also be resistant to other fungicides as well. And that obviously creates a nightmare when we're trying to develop management programs. And so in our FRAME project and through studies here in the US, we know we have seen resistance to FRAC 11, FRAC 3, FRAC 7. So that's strobies, demethylation inhibitors, SDHIs, FRAC 50, so Vivando and Perlevo, and FRAC 13, so Quintec or quinoxaphene. And then same with botrytis bunch rot. We've seen FRAC 11, 3, and 7 resistance there. And really what we've noticed in our sampling across Oregon, Washington, and California is 68% of our powdery mildew samples that we collected were resistant. We knew they were resistant. We were testing them for FRAC 11 resistance. So we knew they were going to be FRAC 11 resistant, so we're pretty sure. But 68% were resistant to both FRAC 3 and FRAC 11. So that's a big deal, because obviously if we're not using frac 11, some people would lean on frac 3s, and this is a problem. So now we have a fungal population that's resistant to 2 modes of action, making it more difficult for us to develop programs too. Even worse, in botrytis, just simply because botrytis is exposed to so many fungicides, 90% of our botrytis isolates were resistant to at least one frac group, and 15% were resistant to 3 or more frac groups. And so this is exceptionally concerning, that we're having a building population of botrytis that is going to be unresponsive to the majority of chemistries, the majority of the synthetic chemistries that we're throwing at it. So that's concerning. And what we're talking about there is multiple resistance in a fungus. So this is a graphic from that paper that Tim and I produced, kind of describing the different pathogens. And again, we see in downy mildew, we see resistance to frac 11 and frac 40. In powdery, we see resistance to frac 11 and 3 most commonly. Occasionally frac 7, but that one's a little more difficult to pin down. Botrytis cinerea, it's a bunch. We don't really use a whole lot of frac 9s. Maybe you do in California, but we see multiple resistance to 7 and 9 and 11 and 17 across the US. But even worse, we start to see in botrytis what we call multi-drug resistance. So this isn't a bunch of little mutations and a bunch of little different genes or other things causing resistance to this fungicide and this fungicide, so that are just like a lot of little mutations combined. These are kind of a really big single mutation that makes it resistant to a lot of things, right? So it's a single mutation to a lot of things. And we're starting to see that potentially bubble up in botrytis, so that's not good. But we do routinely see cross resistance. We see this in a lot of fungicide products, particularly frac 11s and frac 3s, that if they develop resistance to one frac product, like one frac 11 product, they're likely resistant to all other frac 11 products. The exception to that, when talking about the DMIs or frac 3, is not all DMIs behave the same. And same with SDHIs or frac 7. So sometimes a fungus, either botrytis or powdery, or in some cases downy, will be resistant to one frac 3 product, but actually still a different frac 3 product or a different frac 7 product will still show some efficacy. So we do see that, and a lot of that is how resistance to those particular fungicides work. In this case, the fungi actually are able to either detoxify or have multiple copies of the sensitive or resistant gene in them to kind of deal with that particular mode of action of fungicide, or the actual active ingredient just is behaving slightly differently. So we do see sometimes if we lose one frac 3 fungicide, perhaps sometimes the newer versions that are coming out still can have some efficacy in the vineyard. So that's a good thing. That's like a bright spot, that we can maybe use those same number rotations, but maybe introduce some of the newer products and see decent efficacy. So our frac 3 resistance updates, so you guys know those at tebuconazole, difenoconazole, et cetera. We definitely have that in powdery mildew, and so resistance is present to that in powdery mildew in the United States. There's multiple point sources. The mechanism for resistance is kind of multiple point mutations or an overexpression of how the fungus can detoxify the product. And so we call that quantitative. So that's where, if you kind of up the rate a little bit, sometime of the fungicide, you can maybe regain some efficacy. Or you guys might notice it on a label that a product used to say, hey, 4 ounces to 6.6 ounces. But then you've noticed special local needs labels or new labels say, just use the 6.6, or and maybe use 8 ounces. And so you'll notice that over time, if you start to see rate increases on a fungicide label, it's usually related to the trying to overcome this type of quantitative resistance in that particular product. Frac 7, so you guys know it's boscalid, fluopyram, et cetera. So we do have resistance to that in the United States in both powdery mildew and botrytis sponge rot. It's a single point mutation similar to frac 11 fungicides, but there are multiple different types of single point mutations that can result in the same type of fungicide resistance. So there's multiple different options for this, or not really options, but there are multiple ways that this fungi can develop resistance to frac 11 or frac 7 fungicides. The difference is every different type of genetic change in the fungus results in a different way in how that fungus will interact with certain fungicides. Some of those mutations actually make the fungus more sensitive to FRAC7 fungicide. So that's like, good. Can we have more of that, please? Like, please make these fungi more sensitive to fungicides. That'd be awesome. But a lot of them will obviously increase the resistance profile. So different types of mutations can have different results within the fungus. So if you are interested in going really deep, especially for the crop consultants in the room, on different mechanisms and which fungicides have been identified or targeted for powdery mildew management and botrytis management and downy mildew management. This is a QR code to that American Journal of Phenology and Viticulture article that is reviewing fungicide resistance, and it is open access, so it's free to read and download, and it's actually a very easy written or easy to read article with lots of infographics to kind of explain it and walk through processes. So I do recommend checking that out. I think it's also on the main page. If you go to American Journal for Phenology and Viticulture, it's on their main landing page right now to review. So I see some cameras up, so I'll wait till I see them go down and I'll change the slide. All right, so let's quickly go through some idled vineyard blocks and mildew management. Let's tie that together. So the first thing I want to say for those of you that are managing next to idled or abandoned vineyards that are being called idled, because that's just a nicer term than saying abandoned, all is not lost, right? So from a disease management perspective, powdery mildew spores specifically, and similar with botrytis, but mostly powdery, they do spread. We know this. They do blow in the wind. That's the mechanism for dispersal, but they don't really actually travel that far. And so worry about your vineyard management. The likelihood that there is pressure coming from your neighbor from a lot of other things, insects, leaf roll, red blotch, etc. So there's other reasons that your neighbor should be managing the vineyard if in your particular area. But having mildew over there doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a harder time controlling mildew in your block. If that is the case, if you do notice that a hot spot over here and suddenly you're starting to see a lot more mildew in your block, that might be more indicative of your own spray equipment. None of us want to admit this, but you may want to take a look at your own spray equipment and efficacy in your program. Because I will say, I'm an academic, and as my brother likes to remind me, those who can't teach. So in theory, I should not be managing a vineyard, but I do manage vineyards here at WSU. If I can control powdery mildew down to the vine in spray programs here, where this is a diseased vine and this is a healthy check in our spray controls, you guys definitely can with your awesome skill sets at vineyard management and good equipment versus what we have here at the university. So again, mildew does travel, but it's very short distances. If you have a solid spray program in place, you should be okay, but still definitely talk to your neighbor to hopefully they'll do some sulfur dusting, etc., in the abandoned or idle block that's next to you. If things build up enough over time, that can be a problem. But I would honestly be more concerned with viral load and insect pest pressure coming off of an abandoned block than I would of mildew impacting my particular block, as long as I'm managing it appropriately. The other thing to think about when we're starting to tie together weather and a potential super El Nino or etc. is vine stress can impact the performance of the pesticides that you're putting on. So when vines are heat stressed or water stressed, a lot of those systemic or translaminar products will not work as well because they're not being taken up by the plant or metabolized by the plant in the same way. So when we start really stressing plants, we do have to be careful of the products we're putting on. This also goes for those of you that might be idling blocks. There may be this temptation to say, hey, so I'm not going to water my block because I don't want a big canopy. I do want to do some disease control, but I don't necessarily want to do sulfur on a 14-day schedule. I would like to do a 21-day schedule. Oh, look, this pesticide, this particular fungicide gives me 21-day intervals. Maybe I'll just do that. But if you're not watering your vineyard, if the canopy is stressed and it's hot, that product will not move and metabolize in the plant to give you that same window of efficacy. So you do have to be careful that fungicides work best on healthy plants, right? It's the baseline healthy, not disease, but in terms of just baseline water status and nutrient status. When we start switching to vineyards that might be more stressed because they're being idled or abandoned, you may have to switch to more traditional contact fungicides to control disease in those particular blocks. Excessive canopy growth, right? So if you didn't prune the vineyard or if you've super pruned, had a heavy wet spring and now you have a lot of both count shoots and then non-count shoots going like crazy, canopy density obviously will influence your disease management, and it influences it in a couple of ways. One, the microclimate favorability for disease, and two, spray penetration. So denser canopies, bigger canopies increase your risk of powdery mildew development. So you can imagine there's not a whole lot of shade and moisture going on in this canopy, but in here it's a powdery mildew haven once you get in past that those outer leaves. So if you're dealing with bigger canopies in a potential idled block or even in your own, the bigger the canopy means you need to get, if you're going to then treat that canopy, you do have to get product to where it needs to go. So if you are sulfur dusting a block that you have not pruned, the likelihood of that sulfur really doing you any good inside of the canopy is going to be pretty minimal. It's very difficult to get that sulfur into the interior of the canopy unless you're truly dusting from below, not airplane distributed dusting. The other way to go around that is go back to traditional spray programs where you use a lot of water. So water is one way to get a product evenly distributed into the canopy, water and air, of course, with air blast sprayers. So as we move into managing potential idle blocks, even if you are only going to do a sulfur program every so many weeks or so, you may need to check, do you have the right sprayer to do that? If you have a low water volume sprayer, it's probably not going to work very well for managing disease in idle blocks because your canopies will just be too big and you'll not be able to put out the amount of gallons per acre that you need to get water and the product to where it needs to go. So bigger canopies mean more water volume for controlling disease in those bigger canopies. Stretch intervals is challenge number 3. So if you don't have your fruit sold, you don't need to keep your vineyard fruit squeaky clean. So while we don't like you to stretch intervals when you are dealing with synthetic chemistries or high-risk fungicides, if you are doing a contact product like sulfur or oil, you can stretch intervals. It just means you're going to have to also accept a little more disease than what you're probably used to if you in a traditionally managed vineyard. So this is a recommendation for an idled block, not a traditionally managed block. So again, you can stretch intervals on a contact product. You will have a little more disease, but you'll keep the canopy healthy enough to be able to pull it back out of idle in a year or two. The point though, my 3.5 stretch intervals is it goes back to that, the type of product you're choosing. So if you are going to stretch intervals in an idled block and potentially spray a product on some existing mildew, these have to be multi-site contact products. You cannot use targeted or high-risk fungicides in that type of setting because those products are not curative. They're not designed to be applied to existing mildew. You will essentially help select for fungicide resistance, which will become a bigger problem when you start to pull that block out of idle and want to use those chemistries for actual disease control on fruit that you have contracts with, right? So we want to avoid that situation. So if you're going to do these types of, reduced inputs, you need to stick with multi-site contact products in a vineyard management setting. And some tips for that, going back to water volume, the other challenge you might notice, especially for those with exchangeable nozzles, is when you start to use more multi-site products in your vineyard, they will chew through your nozzles faster. So just something to be aware of. So the more you spray these products, the more likely you're going to have to swap nozzles out on your equipment. So just something to keep in mind. The more sulfur you use, the more you have to pay attention. Sort of sulfur, bicarbonate, etc. oils, you have to pay attention to the state of your nozzles and swap them at least once a year, if not twice a year, depending on the frequency in which you're spraying. The other thing too, if you are doing a regular traditional spray and you're using multi-sites, those products work best. You can use slightly the lower rate range on shorter intervals, but obviously if you're going to do stretched intervals with multi-sites in an idled block, you are looking to spray at the higher concentrations or higher rates listed on those labels because those higher rates are more likely to have a semi-curative effect if there happens to be existing mildew in the block. So that's kind of the mental change we have to make too when we're switching from regular management to idled management. The other thing we don't recommend is rescue sprays. So I think folks, when they're treating for powdery mildew in an idle block, they initially think they're going to be very comfortable with having a little bit of mildew, but then they see it and it's like, ooh, I guess I'm not comfortable with this. This is not what I'm used to. So they want to do a rescue canopy spray. You can do that again if you're using a multi-site product, but note that canopy will show signs of stress once the powdery mildew gets killed. It'll also take leaf tissue with it. But the worst thing you can do is spray a high risk fungicide like a frac 11, a frac 3, a frac 7, a frac 13 on existing powdery mildew. So if you see existing mildew in an idle block, do not spray those targeted or high resistance risk products, because that will select for fungicide resistance. If you want some light reading, I'll actually jump to the next slide because all of these articles are on located here on the Frame website. But we do have a number of articles through both the Frame group. The Frame group is a group of scientists that are working on fungicide resistance in grapes on both mildew. So the Frame website has articles on both mildew management, on fungicide resistance management, on spray technologies, on weather that influences diseases, all things related to grape disease management across the US. So I highly recommend taking a look at some of those articles if you're interested in more on fungicide resistance and disease development. And I'm going to leave that up, Jason, and I think I can take some audience questions if we have any.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michelle. So do we have questions? And we're gonna pass the microphone around if you do.
My question is just, you didn't really address dusting, sulfur dusting, and seems like, I know I like to use dusting when canopies get kind of big and nasty. So could you address that?
So yeah, we mentioned a little bit that the challenge with sulfur dusting is it's how you tend to dust. And I'm assuming you're dusting from an actual dusting machine that's ground operated versus aerially operated. So aerial operated dusting does not give you canopy distribution that you need, right? So a lot of abandoned blocks at least here in Washington, are using aerial application of dusting sulfurs. That's not going to get sulfur to where it needs to go in a very dense canopy. But if you are dusting from below with enough air volume to get through the canopy, then you're fine. The challenge with sulfur dust is it just needs to get to where it needs to go. And again, depending on how you're choosing to dust will change its penetration into the canopy. But if you're ground dusting and you have enough air to get it in there, then you're fine. If you're aerially dusting, you do have to be a little careful because that often just covers the outside of the canopy and you will not get sulfur to where it needs to go. Fine for early season stuff, but once canopies get full, aerial dusting becomes a problem.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Michelle, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there we go.
In regards to your DMI, your frac group 3, and the resistance that you guys have been focusing on over actually the last couple of years since I've been involved, do you know the data that you pulled? Can you contribute that just to single use of just 3s, pre-mixtures, and also can you tie that back to, are they typically reducing the rate, the low label rate to begin with? That's why we're seeing that, or what's your conclusion around?
Right. Yeah, no. So this is the hard part, right? Because we pull so if it goes back to failure happens in the vineyard, we pull samples, then we, fungicide resistance for DMI, testing for DMI resistance is very difficult to do genetically. So we're doing the good old spray and pray, grow some mildew, put it on a leaf, spray it with different DMIs, see if it's resistant to it. When we pull those samples, we often don't get very clear or direct answers to questions on frequency of use, spray records, et cetera. Some of those are not always directly shared. And then obviously what we record that we did and what actually happens once it goes through the purchasing, mixing and loading and treatment, there's sometimes is a disconnect there. But typically most of these samples are pulling from vineyards that are not single use, not repeated single use of DMIs, right? So they've used DMIs historically, 10, 15 years, either once a year or twice a year. So it's a part of a regime, a regular use. So it's not single use. Whether they go below rate or not, I'm probably guessing is they are, because if we get their actual spray records, they say, oh, I spray, mixing it in 50 gallons an acre. But if you start doing the back math and you have a 300-gallon tank and you spray, then you realize like you are probably driving a little too fast, or your nozzles might be clogged. So you're not actually putting out the product that you think you are. So that's the challenge. There's the intentional rate reduction, right? Where you're legitimately only mixing 3 ounces in your spray tank versus 5. Then there's rate reductions that happen because your machines are not properly calibrated. And it's that latter point that I think we are inadvertently putting out lower rates than what we want to because we have machines that are not properly calibrated. So I think it's a combination of both that repeated multi-year use of a product, and then of course the lower rate. But that's if people are being truthful with the records we get.
No other questions? Yeah, we recorded this, so I'll be able to send it out to our. If no other questions, I want to thank again Michelle for her time today and the expertise. So round of applause, please, for Michelle. Thank you so much, Michelle. And next time you're down here, look us up. We owe you lunch and some wine.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Jason.
All right. Thanks
Thank you,
again.
guys. Have a great day.
And Rachel's here with the sign-in sheet for CEUs and the forms, so you don't forget.